Hey, this is Todd. This is, I guess, a special Friday edition of the RPG Breakfast Club, just doing a one-on-one with Matt Finch of Frog Gods. Thanks, Matt, for coming in, and thanks, Pex, for setting this up. It was an unexpected boon to my schedule, so I appreciate that. You're in Texas, Matt, I think, right?
I am, yeah.
Whereabouts?
Houston?
Oh, I lived in Houston for 15 years.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I'm a little southwest of Houston in Sugar Land. But...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very, very well aware of Sugar Land. Yeah, I have friends living around there. How's the weather these days?
It's actually kind of nice right at the moment. We had a real cold snap a couple days ago, and I'm not a big fan of cold, but it's heating back up again.
Yeah, it's always amazing particularly when I was living there, but even still, when Houston will pop up in the news or in media and stuff like that. And I remember it was on Showtime a long time ago. It was a television show about astronauts, and it took place in the Houston area, obviously, with the NASA and everything. And I remember watching it, and I liked it, and I think Peter Weller was in it. And there was a moment in the show where I realized that they really had nowhere near the actual location of Houston, because they were talking about one of the astronauts or somebody related to them, and they said they lived in Pearland, and I just started just laughing hysterically.
Yep.
Because clearly they had never actually visited Houston or talked to anyone from Houston if they were calling it Pearl. I just imagined some production person was like, "Oh, look at that Pearland. It sounds so pretty, so beautiful." Yep. No, it's Pearland. Sorry, guys. Anyhow, Pex, I guess, smartened me up. Do you guys have a Kickstarter coming out? You want to give me the skinny out? Swords and Wizardry?
Okay, well, I mean, Swords and Wizardry, most people know, is basically the rules of original Dungeons and Dragons before first edition Advanced D&D came out, and it's the full scope of what was in original D&D. So it includes the starting box plus all of the supplements that were published and the various articles from the Strategic Review and the Dragon, plus it draws on Eric Holmes's Blue Basic set. And so Swords and Wizardry is a rewrite of those rules, and we're doing a Kickstarter now for the box set. The game's been around since 2008. And we've through the sort of the history of it, we've had people asking for a box set since it's based on an original box set. And we're in a position to be able to do that as a Kickstarter now. So that's what we're doing. We've got, there's a box set. There's also a variant cover for it that's much more retro, harks back to the wood grain box of the very first printing of original D&D, which is available, but the contents of the box are exactly the same. It's just that we're doing a limited run of 500 of those, so there's some collector value there. And it comes with a DM screen, a new version of a DM screen, which will fit into the box. It is one of those lower, the box is digest size, again, like the original books. And so the DM screen is one of the shorter DM screens that you see, about the height of a CD case. And it's a lot longer than your regular DM screen. So it'll fit around pages, which is really there's a couple benefits to that. I like the lower ones better. And a module that I'm writing, and there's the first of several supplements is going to be in there. It's a book of monsters. Next one will probably be a book of house rules that are options for people to tack into the game, and then probably monsters again. And we're going to continue coming out with those supplements and with more modules for it as we go along. This is kind of a reboot of the product line in terms of the way that it looks, and in terms of the physical reality of the books themselves. It's often more difficult to play with a single 8.5 by 11 book than it is to have the parts of it divided out, so the players can be looking at a player book. The DM's got an individual little monster book that they can have open. There's a spell book for players to refer to when stuff's actually going on. So it's sort of a redesign and a reboot of the whole product line getting started, and it's done really well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it was always nice with the three little books that you could just hand off the players one to the players, and you still have the monsters and the stuff about the dungeon that you could have behind your screen or just in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people don't realize is that some of the effects of the production market will change the way that books are being sold. So, for example, when we first printed this book, binding was very expensive, paper was very cheap. And so, your most economical thing to make for people was a single book so that you were only paying for binding once. And it didn't much matter adding additional pages to the book. And then nowadays, paper tends to be more expensive and binding tends to be cheaper. And so we're in this case, since the binding costs are lower, we're able to do that, group of multiple books so that people can have the specific reference open to them. That's also a reason why you're not seeing giant RPG books anymore, is simply because the cost of the paper has risen. So a little, interesting fact.
No, that's cool. I mean, I'm grateful. Those giant Bible tomes are just, I mean, now I guess we're all, older adults driving around. It's not that bad, but I remember trying to cart some of that stuff around when I was younger, hoofing it in a backpack, and man, painful.
Yeah.
I really like that wood grain box, by the way. That's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're looking at two different markets with this. One of them is the group of people who've been with us since 2008. Those tend to be people who started with either with the original books or with the advanced D&D books. Some people who started with second edition, but people who've been involved, in a sort of retro and vintage old school atmosphere in terms of what they want. And then there's the newer players to whom we're trying to, point out that, hey, this is, as the forerunner of fifth edition, which, the vast majority now of younger players started with, this is an alternate play style that has, or it's a set of simple, easy to learn rules that, because they are fairly open ended, creates a different, an entirely different style of play to it. With emergent phenomena, if you want to, an interesting term, things that come out of the rules, is that, people will spend more time doing exploration. They'll spend more time doing puzzle solving, because combat is not so long that you have to budget your time during a session to handle an adequate number of combats when those take a lot of time. You can tend to focus on other things. And so, getting that sort of concept out into the fifth edition audience. And so that's partly the reason for the two different boxes, really, that, the original audience for the game and the collectors are tending to focus on that variant box cover, the wood grain one. I think that generally the younger crowd is gravitating immediately to the one that's got the printed box set with the colors. It's just more familiar. People will go with what they're familiar with. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. I know obviously fifth edition's been this new boom with the Critical Role and all that. Joe Manganiello, or whatever his name is, the guy from True Blood and others. Have you seen some of that? Have you seen some trickle down of renewed or new interest in some of in the Swords and Wizardry and other stuff that you guys are doing?
Well, yes. Although interestingly, it doesn't seem to be as much as there was when we went from third edition to fourth edition, because, at that point, people were so upset with fourth edition that they started looking around for something new. And with fifth edition, I think it brought in a huge number of completely new players. And so, in this generation, they're not so much looking for, they're not so much looking around various editions of D&D to find something new yet. When sixth edition comes in, I imagine that audience will say, well, okay, I could re-up to a new edition of D&D, or hey, there are these older editions as well. I think once you get a generation that has their starting edition superseded by a later edition, every time that happens, I think there is some new interest in the older versions. The thing was that when we went from fourth to fifth, there were so few people who had really started with fourth that didn't so much happen.
Yeah, that's true. It was such a great, I guess, schism between the people who really went for fourth and enjoyed it, and the others that I could see that And I guess the whole and plus, right, the whole OSR thing was really taking off at that point, becoming its own thing. I really find it interesting now because so much of the old stuff is available that it makes it almost a new ball game. So it definitely interests me, how you guys are repackaging and doing stuff, because now you can go on drive-through and you can get, I don't know, BX or Holmes or those editions, just obviously not originals, but either print on demand or digital copies of the original. So it really kind of pushes, I guess, as creators who are working in the OSR space to really do something a little bit differently or package it in a better way. Because originally, right, it was that these older rule sets were either very expensive because you could only get them on the secondary eBay kind of market, or you just couldn't find them at all.
Yeah, it's interesting when the whole OSR. I mean, where you put the origin of the OSR is debatable, but if you take a look at the publishing side of it, which pretty much launched with Osric in 2006, and also with Chris Gonerman's BFRPG, the older books were actually still fairly economical at that point. And so when Stuart Marshall and I wrote Osric, there was an awful lot of, well, why are you even doing that? Why shouldn't people just play with the old books? And really, at that point in time, the answer was because this lets you publish things using the first edition AD&D rules legally, because it was worked through the SRD and the OGL, and I won't go into the details of the legal on that. But really, Osric was a legal innovation more than it was a gaming innovation. And we certainly were saying, at a certain point in time, the older books are going to get more expensive, and so this will help out. But really, that was a publisher's tool, or at least it was intended like that. And at the time that it launched, I mean, Swords and Wizardry was, we had seen the popularity of retro clones during the 2 years after Osric, and so Swords and Wizardry was published more as a complete playable game than Osric originally was. And also for Swords and Wizardry, the original box sets really were very expensive. And if you were looking for strategic review, that was a collector's item. And the early Dragon magazine stuff, that was a collector's item. But really, right at the very beginning of the OSR, it was purely a tool for publishers because of people being concerned that places like Dragon's Foot, where people were publishing first edition AD&D stuff, that the OSR was going to really just sort of become a pirate organization where, all of this stuff was technically illegal. It had copyright violations, and we wanted to make it more of an acceptable kind of thing for people to be doing, and so that was in there as well. But yeah, the books at that point in time were fairly cheap. Now they're really expensive, all of them. The collectors have really, clearly that the market for the old D&D books is very hot, and those are very expensive, and not really purchasable for playable purposes anymore.
Yeah, I was lucky to get a few, not way long ago, but I was able to rebuy some of the stuff that I had lost, which was good. I think if you're really kind of canny and you pick and choose, you could probably still get stuff for reasonable cost. But yeah, it's a lot more economical now to get the clones or get the get an OSR book. And yeah, I mean, if from a someone who uses that stuff, it's from the way that you guys were able to find, now when it's called a loophole, but a way to be able to publish new material for a sort of pseudo universal old school style system or set of systems is great, because it really allowed people to, I guess, keep that game style alive in a sense beyond just scattered isolated tables playing their games. And open it up to a whole bunch of other innovations and new ways of looking at it. I am curious, just in the future, it'll definitely be interesting when, as you said, the 5th edition into, say, a 6th edition, because I feel like with the new players coming to D&D, the style of play between OSR and modern D&D is so different in some fairly fundamental ways, whether a lot of them will really be interested in going backwards to when wizards, don't have spells they can just fire up at all times, and things like that. I wonder, do you think there would ever be sort of a midpoint, whereas maybe taking some of the 5th edition sensibilities and backporting them to a more of an OSR system to sort of please maybe some of the modern gamers? Or do you think that's just I don't know, it would water it down too much and make it please no one.
I think it'll depend a lot on what 6th edition looks like, because the periodic growth of the OSR every time that a new edition comes out is, I think, a reaction to whatever the new edition looks like. I think we got the reaction fast and strong at the beginning of 4th edition because Wizards really botched their release of 4th edition, and so that exodus started early. I think it remains to be seen whether 6th edition goes back toward the 3rd edition, highly granular, highly elegant rule system that has everything seamlessly integrated and therefore becomes fairly difficult to house rule. If they do that, I think you will see a lot of interest in taking a look back at the earlier systems. If they make it even more flexible than 5th edition, which is obviously still way more granular and way more complex than the early editions, but is way more old school than 3rd edition was. So if they make it even lighter, then I don't think there will be very much attempt to really integrate on behalf of 5th edition. I think in that case, you'll see more people. It's hard to say. I mean, it's going to. I think it's going to depend a lot on what 6th edition looks like.
Yeah, I can't imagine they're in much of a hurry to do that. I know I'm not necessarily inklings of what they're going to do with 6th edition, but just I've heard things in terms of what some of the designers would do differently if they took another crack at it. But I feel like they're in this kind of printing money mode. So I don't know why they would try to put the brakes on that gravy train just yet. So I wanted to switch gears. Something that's been on my mind is obviously I'd kind of heard of you before and read stuff by you, but I think my most direct contact up until now was your Jordoba streams on YouTube. I really enjoyed that, particularly the OD&D one. Whatever happened to those? Was that a scheduling issue? Did they stop? Did you switch formats? I just kind of saw them disappear, and I was bummed out by that.
Yeah, it was when Google Hangouts closed out, and it was before Zoom came in. So for a while there, you had to have some sort of streaming software like OBS or XSplit running at the same time that you were running your actual game. Whereas with Google Hangouts, it was pretty easy. You just basically put everyone in the Hangout and you went ahead. But there's, in doing that game, I was doing a lot of things at once. I was DMing, and at the same time, I was messing around with the miniatures in front of the camera, with a bunch of different cameras going, and adding a third dimension to that of having to monitor what the streaming software was doing just made it really impossible to do the whole everything at once, one-man band kind of thing. So that was the reason for that. I mean, it might be workable to get it started up again with using Zoom, but just the features of Google Hangouts worked so well with that, and it's a ton of work to come out with a show like that. So, again, because it's just a one-man production, so that's why it dropped off. It dropped off almost exactly when Google Hangouts did.
Okay, I didn't make that connection, but it makes sense. I have enough trouble handling duties for streaming just one camera on myself. So yeah, I can't imagine juggle. I know it must have been such a pain, but I really did appreciate those miniature eye views of the dungeons and areas. How much of that 3D printed terrain do you have now? It seems like you had so much. Obviously, you live in a place where you can have space to potentially store all that stuff. I'm now in New York City, and I'd have to 3D print things and put them on my walls because I would have nowhere else to put them. But it really made for amazing layouts.
Yeah, no, that's one of the benefits of living, outside of a city in Texas. You really couldn't do any better for floor space, without moving out to the Midwest somewhere. It's there's plenty of room here for stuff. I've got, obviously just tons and tons of the stuff that was made. So.
Have you guys ever put out a setting book for Jordoba? I saw that there's like a 3D. I think you made a book of some of the, I guess maybe the modeling specs for that. But is there a fluff or crunch kind of tome on Jordoba?
I think I put one up on Drive Through RPG. It's not. There were two things that were done. There was a player's guide that was done with a sort of comic-y look to it, and then there's the Atlas of Secrets, which I think I put out, but I sort of dropped all of that stuff right at the one time and switched over to doing more work with Frog God right at that point, because that was when we started writing the City of Ream. And so I was, the author on that. And then just, we had a lot of stuff going on with the publishing through Frog God. It's probably something that I'll get back to, but, before that's even thinkable, we got to get done with the Swords and Wizardry Kickstarter. And like I said, I still do have to actually write a module. So.
One of the things I thought was really interesting, I paid more attention to the OD&D stream, but you also had that 5th edition stream. How was it running in a similar space for the two different, sort of very different editions? Did you find that you had to tailor a lot of stuff differently for the different groups just because of the editions, or did you pretty much put them through the same sorts of content and just let, however the game is be the game?
Well, I think that the campaign handled both of the two systems together in it really well. The adventures, I think in theory they don't have to be radically different, but I found myself, like you said, tailoring it pretty heavily toward which of the two systems an adventure was going to be in. There are a lot of differences between the way that 5th edition runs and the way that Swords and Wizardry, original D&D runs. And if you want to make a good adventure, you really do have to sort of take into account which system you're using, or else you're going to be leaving something on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I gravitate to a lot of the OSR stuff myself, but when I do videos for my channel, I also know there's a lot of, 5th edition players. So I guess my big struggle, just as a content creator of a sort, is trying to find ways that either you can kind of apply some old school stuff to your new school game, that if it's possible. So it's always interesting when someone is physically running both games at the same time. What kind of the takeaways from one are to another. I played a halfling thief in a Swords and Wizardry game a couple of years ago, and that was a lot of fun. I mean, I appreciated that from the Swords and Wizardry stuff, how it sort of streamlines and it just kind of evens out the bumps in the road, so to speak, in some of the old school systems. I remember Osric, which I think was the first OSR rule set that I picked up. It was great because it was basically, it felt like just, this is basically as close to AD&D as you can get without getting into getting sued by wizards. But I felt like the Swords and Wizardry stuff kind of just, you guys rewrote things a certain way and just kind of smoothed it out and made it. I remember when I played in the Swords and Wizardry game, even though I was a player, not the GM, having to help some of the GM and some of the other players get through it, and just the layout and everything made it much easier for me to explain than, say, if I'd gone back to, if we were running straight AD&D or even BX, and definitely if we were running one of those directly. Just the, I don't know, I love the Gygaxian stuff, and I love the density of some of that, but it can be super daunting to new players and GMs to get into. And I think Swords and Wizardry kind of, like I said, smooths that out a lot.
Yeah. I mean, as a rule system, OD&D is actually a lot easier to learn than first edition AD&D, or at least it would be. As a rule system, it is. In terms of the presentation of it, it was the first RPG that anyone had ever written. So, I mean, they got some stuff, right on the money. I mean, they were professional rules writers for war games and so on, but some of the things were just dead wrong. There were omissions in there, which in retrospect are nice because it allows you to, easily fill in with a house rule what it was that was missing there. But of course, at the time, not having anything in there is sort of daunting for new players. And, and so the way we handled that in Swords and Wizardry, whenever there was a big omission, like the initiative rules, which you were supposed to use the chainmail initiative rules, but they really didn't integrate very well with D&D, was to give a whole bunch of different options that people used, and then talk a little bit in there about here's the effect of using this initiative system as opposed to using this initiative system. Which ones are faster, which ones add a little bit more depth, so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's nice. I always feel like OD&D reads so much better after you've actually maybe read some other D&D rules. Like I think if you started off with BX or Holmes and then went back to OD&D, I guess maybe because they fill in some of those omissions, but then it reads so much more easily because you really do recognize all the stuff that, oh yeah, this is D&D and it's right there. But I think putting it in front of somebody as just a new piece of material, particularly if they don't have a war games background or maybe aren't familiar with some of the stuff, just the layout is it's tough. But there's so much great stuff in there. I find myself consistently going back and pulling out kind of wonderful things out of those books, maybe more than any other one. I always felt like with AD&D that it was basically, I don't know. I know there was a whole Arneson Gygax kind of part of the Fallout that was part of that. But the other thing I felt like was that he'd spent, I don't know, 10 years or 8 years answering people's letters and talking about house rules and being these sort of like, yeah, your house rule's good. And I know we're getting more into organized play. And I felt like the DMG just got crammed with basically every kind of house rule edge case that they could fit. And I remember back when I was playing it, we certainly didn't play with everything. And we pretty much, I don't know, we just knew, or I don't know, the culture was such that we knew that, okay, we can kind of pick and choose which rules we want to use. But I think retrospectively, when people go back and read it, it just seems like an incomprehensible mess of rules. And I always have to tell people, like, well, you don't have to play with all that. And I don't even know if there was really an expectation in their minds that you would play with all of those rules.
No, I don't really think there was. I mean, that they had clearly run into people who wanted to have a rule for everything, and they were a little bit confused by that when they began to run into it out there. And there, one of the reasons that TSR didn't come out with modules particularly early in the in the release was because they couldn't understand why people wouldn't want to write their own adventures. And so that was one, missed opportunity that sort of got filled in by Judges Guild for a while, and then TSR started coming out with the modules. But they're definitely they when they ran into the more mainstream audience that was out there, there were some things that they clearly hadn't expected, and that's one of the fun things to talk to Tim Kask about. Is because he was there while all of that stuff was going on, and has some pretty good stories about. The reaction that TSR had to this sudden, explosion of a fan base that included a lot of people who were not war gamers. And so they didn't have they didn't necessarily share the same assumptions that the folks at TSR had expected that all fans would share. So that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got into it. I was born in 73, and I think right around either 79 or 80, I had basically both. I can't remember what I got first, or I had basically the AD&D books and the BX books at the same time. And I think at that age, and I would have been lost without modules because I just would have had no idea what to do. Obviously, I think as an adult, if I had seen it now and I'd been a war gamer and other things, and it would have been totally made sense to me. Like, okay, we'll create a scenario and we'll go from there. But yeah, I think they were just running into kind of like that whole journey from the white box through Holmes' first attempt to kind of make more user-friendly, beginner-friendly rules up into the basic box of, what do you do when you're running up into people who don't have a background anymore, that they're coming really fresh. Which reminds me, did you start with the three books? When did you get involved in the hobby?
I started. It must have been sometime around 78. Although I think, I remember what I was doing was I was born in 67, and at a really, really young age, I started getting into Napoleonic wargaming, and then read The Lord of the Rings. And so in the hobby stores at that time, they sold things like model rockets and balsa airplanes and, snap together kits of tanks and things that you'd paint. And they had the war game figures there. And so that's where I went to go look at the war game figures. And I ran across a copy of the Monster Manual and read that, without really understanding what it was, because at that point I was young enough to think that, games only really came in boxes. And so I didn't actually start playing until the Holmes box set came out, which is the one with the dragon looking forward at the adventurers. And so it had to be 78 because those books weren't out before 78. And then the Player's Handbook was already out at that point. And so we started playing the Holmes Basic set, which only went up to 3rd level. And then we bought a copy of the Player's Handbook and then had to wait for the Dungeon Master's Guide to ultimately come out because it had not been published yet. They came out with the books. First came the Monster Manual, which was pretty usable with original D&D. Then they came out with the Player's Handbook, and then later they came out with the Dungeon Master's Guide. So everybody had to, if you wanted saving throw information or to hit tables, since the Dungeon Master's Guide wasn't out and they weren't in the Player's Handbook, and you only went up to 3rd level in the basic set, you had to get a photocopy of the ones of the actual tables from OD&D. So people finding those, and they were, getting distributed, just those particular tables around. So I sort of started with a mishmash of the Holmes Basic set, parts of Advanced D&D, and attack tables from OD&D, which is, the people who started in that, particular 3-year period or however long it was, really have no problem mashing together D&D rule sets because you had to in order to play it at that point. There was no complete, here is, D&D.
Yeah, it seems crazy now to think of how they really had no transition plan, or at least no good plan from, Holmes to AD&D or Holmes to BX, or how that was going to work. I know in the Holmes set, they have these things that, for more, go see, AD&D. And it's, depending on when you bought the Holmes set, those books might not exist yet when you have it. So yeah, you definitely, and like I had BX and Advanced at the same time, and I'm pretty sure, we just commingled whatever we thought was cool for both books. And the rules are so similar that if there was any kind of balance issues or anything like that, I mean, not that we had even the terms balance in our brains at that point. It was, super easy to get around. When did you start getting into the, wanting to do, on the other side of it, writing and publishing work for the hobby?
Well, really not until about 2000. I mean, I guess when 3rd edition came out, and that was still, a kind of a low interest kind of thing. It really, I'd always, and this is one of the things I say about, people in the publishing industry. There's one very, very common trait in all of them, which is that whenever any of us wrote adventures for our home groups back in the day, there was this real tendency to try and make them look like modules. And so people who are sort of trying to, make them look like modules is something that's really, really common among publishers. So there's definitely that to look back into the history of when I was playing. But I didn't really, I mean, I wrote one thing after 3rd edition with a friend of mine, and but I wasn't one of the publishers on that. He published it. It was heavily edited to work with 3rd edition. And then really it wasn't until Osric. And like I said, with Osric, that wasn't written for the creative side of me. That was written, because I happened to be an attorney. I happened to see a way to get this stuff published legally that was being published at that time with tremendous copyright violations. And I really didn't get not really into it until Swords and Wizardry, when I started writing modules. I can't remember if I wrote any modules around the time of Osric.
The SRD, the OGL, it's got to be one of the most significant things that's happened in the hobby, right? I mean, I know that I don't know if Wizards would be happy or annoyed that they let that happen or let it slip out or however, but it's really had a giant effect. I think ultimately, as far as the end user and end person in a better environment, but it really is interesting how that, I don't know, just became its own, I guess took on a life of its own, for lack of better words.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether they're. I think they're ambivalent about it, but there's some good things for Wizards that happened as a result of that. They probably gave up some market share as a result of it. Although I do think that a lot of the stuff that's being published as OSR games right now would probably still be represented by a bunch of people writing either variant games or things like that. So I don't really think that they lost much market share, and I do think that they supported, third edition D&D when that came out. So, but yeah, I know, I totally agree with you. It was massively significant. Also, Mike Battleotto is pointing out that I wrote a module for Osric called Pod Caverns of the Sinister Shroom, which is a fun one.
That's a great name. I'll have to check it out. Yeah, Osric, I remember like way back in the day, I think just being like stunned that it was out there at all. But it was great because I think at the time I didn't have my AD&D books back. So I was like, oh, there's this thing that's got everything I could want from first edition back in. How hard was it, or how laborious was it to parse through obviously if you're a lawyer, it's probably easier for you than anyone else to go through all the OGL and match it up with the rules and figure out how close you could get before you had to kind of, I don't know, change a number or slightly alter an algorithm to stay on sort of the right side of the law.
Yeah, it was pretty time consuming. Now, I mean, my participation with Osric, I'm billed as initial author on there. I wrote about 85% of what's called Osric 1.0, which was really, it didn't include monsters. It was really, more of a player's handbook that included how to play rules, but it really didn't have much aspect of a dungeon master's guide. It didn't have any monsters in it because, like I said, that was a publisher's tool so that people could refer to this, but they were still expected to be using an old monster manual. Like I said, those books were cheaper then. And it wasn't until, and we thought, there'll be, 100, maybe 150 publishers, who use this. It's all going to be cottage industry. And on the first day that we released it, it had 50,000 unique downloads, which was, just unbelievable that happened. And then instantly, once again, it's kind of like TSR not quite understanding what was going to happen with their game. We kind of didn't understand what was going to happen with Osric, which was that people actually started using it to play with because, it was a PDF. A lot of people use PDFs. It was easy to, it was way cheaper to give, every character, every player, a copy of it, or just say, download this PDF and use it and we'll learn how to play. And then if you want to, you can get the books. And so from that point, Stuart, who had written probably about 15%, I think I calculated once of Osric 1, he entirely did Osric 2.0, although he got a bunch of volunteers in there, including I think I did some of it because I remember writing the Ice Toads entry for the monsters. But Osric 2.0, which is what people see out there now, is much more Stuart's work than it was mine. Like I say, my stuff on it was mainly a legal innovation. And I'm good at rewriting rules, but I mean, I did no game design either on Osric or on Swords and Wizardry. My role wasn't as a designer. It was to duplicate what was already in existence.
Yeah, I know one of the things that got me into Osric, and I guess it's one of those lucky accidents or just the way things work out, is I started getting into playing by forum, places like Dragon's Foot, and I forget some of the other ones I used, but Unseen Servant, I guess, was a big one. And there was great because, you're trying to get in these different games, and I thought it was, I could play, wow, people are running, first edition AD&D, or they're running this, I could play that. And then it became, I don't have those books, but I really want to play. How can we do it? And then, you'd see the link pop up. Hey, go grab Osric. It's got everything you need. And so it really was like of a moment that I guess maybe that's probably what you saw with those downloads. It's just that all these people are starting to play online and lacking resources. And then suddenly there's a handy dandy resource right there for them.
Right, because it's worth pointing out, and it's something that Mike Battleotto just popped up in the text too, is that at that point in time, you couldn't legally get PDFs of the original books. Wizards had not let those out into the wild world yet. So the only way of getting a PDF of any of the old books was going to be a scanned PDF in which every page was a graphic, because scanning technology and PDF technology wasn't nearly as good as it is now. So you could not get for the most part, a PDF of the original Advanced D&D books at all. So, Osric was, because again, it was free. And so that was, a tremendous boost. It would be a little bit less significant now, given that those original PDFs are out there.
Yeah, though some of them are still kind of awful. I think some of the older ones, maybe they just haven't gone through and rescanned them. But I think some of them are pretty bad. I love the Ready Reference Sheets, Judges Guild, and I'm pretty sure that is still just scans. Hopefully they'll go back and fix those, because that's a great resource. I think over the Frog Guys, you guys have handled some of the Judges Guild stuff, right? I want to say you guys came out with a Tegel Manor.
Yeah, we came out with Tegel Manor recently. Way back in the days when we were Necromancer Games, we also did the Wilderlands of High Fantasy and the City-State of the Invincible Overlord. Partly just because Bill Webb, the CEO of Frog God, is just a big Judges Guild fan. He played that stuff, and I love City-State of the Invincible Overlord. I'm not so big on the Wilderlands of High Fantasy, but So Tegel Manor recently, that was sort of a labor of love on Bill's part with that, and it's got enormous maps and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, those are great. City State is amazing. I like Wilderlands just for the tables and things. I guess I know they're sort of, or at least some of them are duplicated in the Ready Reference Sheets, but they're great. I guess it was good that TSR had that gap before they started making modules, because it did allow some of these third parties. You get some of the really great modules of all time coming out on Judges Guild and those other things that maybe wouldn't have made it out into the world if TSR had been pumping out modules from the start.
Yeah, I think that's true. And yeah, you're right. Wilderlands of High Fantasy really did have great tables to it. It just, the setting didn't quite. I mean, the names were awesome. I mean, Viridistan, stuff like that. But really, it was the City-State of the Invincible Overlord that, that's. I mean, you just can't overstate what an incredible product that was at the time.
Yeah, and there's still really nothing like it, I think, or at least I haven't run into it. I know there's other Tolus and other things that are sort of big cities, but I don't know. Nothing seems to be quite the same as the City-State, and I guess they all kind of owe the City-State a little tip of the cap for really being the first. And yeah, it's just so expansive, and there's so much to it, so much going on. It really just makes it a wonderful resource, even if you never run it as its own thing. I don't know. I just find I can just endlessly pull stuff out of those books.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. The Judges Guild stuff is really good for, dipping into and finding something cool. And of course, City-State of the Invincible Overlord has got the same sort of immense organizational problems that OD&D did as well. It's fairly difficult to run, as a sort of city adventure, which is clearly what it was intended to do, the way it was intended to be used. But yeah, I mean, there's something just, lightning in a bottle kind of thing with City-State. I think the Waterdeep thing that Ed Greenwood did is good in its own way, but it's not City-State.
Yeah, I find all those and obviously, like you were saying about OD&D, it's just that they were writing these things for the first time. And like every time I pick up the Ready Reference Sheets, I feel like it takes me 10 minutes to try to remember how all the tables fit together, because sometimes there'll be pages separating them. There's no clear, arrows or anything linking different tables together. I got to remember. Sometimes I'll forget, and I'll think, okay, this is the end of the table. And then I'll say, oh, no, wait, it's supposed to really continue over here. Okay. Figure that out. It always just it's a pain. It's more painful than I think, obviously, it needs to be. But it's just from the era that that it was built on. But yeah, I mean, they just put so much in there, and it's just so dense. And I think that probably even for people running it now, I imagine that you wouldn't make one of those because it's not streamlined, because it is just so much information. I think something like Waterdeep does lose something, if only because it is a bit more focused. It is doesn't have quite that much density, and I'm sure some of that is by design. They're aiming for people who maybe are newer to the hobby and maybe running for low-level characters, and they're just not ready for the full-on craziness that something like City-State provides.
Yeah, I mean, City-State was unbalanced, disorganized, tons and tons of random, ideas in there. And, I think it's pretty clear that there was a decision made with Waterdeep and pretty much with every product after that, to work on making them more playable and less idea rich. And simply because there is a trade-off there. The more idea rich something is, in general, the less playable it's going to be. Just because, and people have always looked for the happy medium between those two. But, City State is a good example of something that is just so incredibly idea rich that in a lot of ways it's virtually unplayable, at least, read as written. If you're trying to follow their organizational scheme of it, it's virtually unplayable, but it's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Though, I guess the flip side is that probably people will not be talking 40 years on or however long it's been, still going back to Waterdeep Dragon Heist, whereas, City State still hanging in there. So yeah, there is something, I guess, as far as legacy or lasting power that is part of that balance that you're trying to find with the richness of ideas, like you're saying. Speaking of, balance, obviously all the older stuff, or I don't know up until what point balance was really not even much of a thought in there beyond. I really always like the OD&D rules of kind of the deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets, and it's pretty transparent. Where do you come out on the sort of hyper balancing type of style that 5th edition has versus the next to no balancing or very different sorts of balancing that the OSR systems have?
Well, Okay, there's two answers there. One of them is balancing among characters, and one of them is balancing between the characters and the monsters. I'm not a big fan of balancing among the characters necessarily. I think that when you look at the weakness of the magic user in 1st edition and 0 edition, you probably could have pumped them up a little bit at first level so that they weren't quite such a glass cannon. But what happens with those is that because you didn't necessarily get improved saving throws or attack rolls or whatever it might be with each and every level, you tended to see, one character would be weak, and then all of a sudden the most powerful one in the party, and then they would drop back down again. Someone else would be the most. So you had this sort of weird fluctuation over time in which one character was more powerful. There wasn't a situation where there was one character who was always more powerful. So you can see the balancing. It was sort of always unbalanced, but always returned to the norm over time. And the older games definitely are looking at a much longer, slower time flow across a campaign than the younger ones are. So, I enjoy the older style more. I can certainly see that other people would enjoy having all of the characters balanced at each and every level. I just find that a little bit less interesting and compelling than this sort of way that it worked before. In terms of balancing the characters against the monsters, I very much prefer the older school approach where things got dangerous the deeper you went, rather than that the DM is expected to only hit you with stuff that's roughly within your power range. Because it was under the control of the players how deep they wanted to go in a dungeon, and they were making their own assessment of here are the risks and here are the rewards. And so that was a strategic decision that people actually made. And that strategic decision is pretty much eliminated from the later games. And I think that, any game is more interesting the more meaningful decisions that are there for the players to make. And so I really think something was lost with that. I can see the value of giving a beginning DM some idea of how hard is this monster. But that was done. There were lists of what monsters would show up at the deeper levels of things. And, when I'm doing, overland adventures, I do the same thing. There's, you're getting more and more into the wilderness. Stuff's going to get more and more dangerous. And here are the sort of signposts or signs that you can get into a more dangerous area. Do you really want to do it? Make that as a decision, rather than just saying, hey, when you're first level, the trip from this town to this town is really easy. But once you're higher level, all of a sudden the whole thing's way harder. How does that happen? That doesn't, it doesn't jibe.
Yeah, totally. The other thing I liked, as far as Overland, was that it would depend on terrain type, which I thought was great because the more remote, and I think what swamps and mountains were just I think the deadliest as far as at least how often you might encounter stuff, which makes sense. They're the ones that would seem the riskiest. So you could take it and maybe it's a shortcut and maybe you think there's a lair or some treasure or something there, but you're going to have to think about it because there's stuff there. And the same thing for dungeons, you want to play it safe. Just noodle around on the first level, but you're not going to get too much out of it. It's particularly if you've been there before recently. And if you want to take your chances, go deeper in. I think that's also why I don't care for milestones, because it's that same thing as you're no longer making those kind of decisions, at least not on more of a character level. It's more that meta decision, since I think almost everybody I know who runs milestones runs it on, when you reach a plot point or you reach some goal that I have as a GM, then hey, you'll get your milestone, which means that as a player now I'm not really thinking about my own advancement. I'm thinking about, well, what does the GM want me to do, and let me go do that, which is really not the kind of decision making that I would appreciate.
I mean, level advancement in the earlier editions was much more like a video game. You get the points however you get them, and then you're going to be able to level up. It wasn't and now I don't hate the milestone system, but in terms of differentiating the two, you're absolutely right. One of them is just how do you accumulate these experience points using your own brain in a world that's largely defined by tables and by adventures, and that is going to be hard in the hard parts and easy in the easy parts. And if you're not high level, you better not get into those hard parts. And now and then it's certainly more story based to the milestone method. I think it can be run in a way that's a little bit more like the old school thing, but you really never get that sort of this is a video game accumulation of points in whatever way you can do it kind of feel of the early editions.
Yeah, I guess I just really, like you, I kind of enjoyed that freedom to sort of make my own decisions. And it was all transparent because you could see everything. You could see the tables. You could look at your odds and say, okay, if it's a 1 in 6 chance of something nasty happening here, but it's a 3 in 6 chance over here. And these things, or, like with dungeon levels, that you can look at the tables and see, oh goodness, if we go down that third level, it may be over our heads. But if we can just hit this one room and we're lucky and we can get out, then we'll get a boon that we would not be able to do if we were just fooling around on that first level. So you get to make those choices. But I mean, I think overall, particularly definitely with the rise of stuff like Critical Role, I think the emphasis is more on, I guess, a DM driven story, the DM as story creator, which is, I guess, my always thing as a DM is I really love those emergent stories, and not that you can't get them, but I think it becomes a different sort of thing. Because I think if you're running a story based campaign as a GM and that's what you're hanging your hat on, then you tend to minimize the opportunities for emergent stories because you're concentrating on that main story coming out. And maybe even true for players too, that if you want to progress in the main story, that you're not considering these other options, which may lead to fascinating emergent stories, but then might take away from the whatever you want to call the main story.
Yeah, I agree. You can mimic one with the other, but certainly the older editions tend to be more friendly to the wide open sandbox with the emergent stories, and the later editions tend to create some restrictions that they certainly give you an incentive to go more toward the storyline because it takes more preparation to run any adventure of any sort, using the newer systems. Whereas with the old ones, you virtually always just drop off to using tables to define what was going to happen. And it was simple enough that, you could get something generated by a table and use it without an enormous amount of time spent, creating the thing that you just rolled up in the table itself. So I imagine that if you used a computer with 5th edition, you could probably run that kind of thing pretty much as easily. It would just have to be spitting out a lot more information than we were rolling in tables in those days. But I think you could simulate it.
Yeah, I'm wondering when the computer stuff's going to catch up, because I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas, at least that I always enjoyed, but I just thought were just too laborious. I always thought stuff like weapon speed were really cool, but I could just never get around to running that because it just seemed like it would just take you too long and too fiddly. But when you have something like Roll20, you could easily wrap weapon speeds up into some kind of Roll20. I don't use Roll20s. I don't know exactly how it works, but I imagine there's some kind of die roll or some kind of macro you could do that you could really fold a lot of stuff into some of these online systems. I'm curious when maybe we might get a rise in RPG complexity when they can take that complexity and hide it behind stuff like apps or modules on Roll20 that can really handle that stuff sort of behind the screen.
Well, the thing is, it's been done. It's called, Skyrim, The Witcher. That if you're going to that depth, I mean, they're going to add in the visuals to give it that sort of whammo, and I think the amount of work that's involved in that, it really hasn't gone through to the tabletop RPGs. But I mean, your point's exactly on point. That it could be done, and I think part of the problem is that editions change, because the moment that an edition changes, all the work that you've done for something like that is just completely gone for the most part.
Yeah, that's true. Though I guess maybe, I mean, I don't know where, I'm not sure where 5th edition ranks as far as longevity of editions, but I guess it's actually getting pretty up there. And I imagine that maybe those editions will keep stretching out more, at least for, I don't know, some of these main product lines. Like, I don't know, Pathfinder was around for a long time before they have, and they're still supporting, one version 1, and now version 2 just launched. But yeah, I mean, definitely you have to figure out, I guess, as a person who would be doing this, is this game going to be around long enough to make all the programming worth it? But I'm just really curious if really some of these maybe more esoteric games, I'm trying to think, like Harn or something, would get second life in electronic form, because now you could really, or Pendragon or something, where you could really hide a lot of the accounting that might and number crunching that might have driven players and GMs away who weren't super into it. But now, since you could just have it mapped to a button press on your keyboard or a mouse click, suddenly you can get some of that great crunchy goodness without actually having to process the crunch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree.
How long do I have you for? Do you need to leave at the top of the hour? Do we need to wrap it up? I wasn't informed, so I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know. How long do you want your show to be?
The ones on Sunday are 2 hours, but I don't want to hold you 2 hours if you can't, if you got other stuff going on. But so I can go whenever.
Well, I mean, all right. Well, I mean, give me a 5-minute break since we're at the top of the hour, and then if you've got stuff for another hour, I can go for another hour.
I can always come up with stuff. That's my superpower, coming up with stuff. So yeah, take 5 minutes, and I'll meet you back in here. All right, for those in chat, we're just taking a 5-minute break, and then we'll be on for hour number 2 with Matt Finch, who has been super generous and not only coming on and talking with me to begin with, but then coming back for second hour. So if you're in the chat and you have stuff you'd like us to talk about, drop it in the chat. Otherwise, I will just keep spitting out new things as they come into my brain. Let's see. I'm just going to read some chat stuff. It's the same. So Mage says it's the same, talking about putting stuff into, I guess, getting it online. It's the same as coding cells in a spreadsheet. For the example of coding weapon speed, you already see it on form-filled PDFs that have the ability to auto-calculate HP, AC, stat modifiers, base, attack bonus. All it needs is for someone to do up the coding and mapping into Roll20, and then share their work on some platform where it can be seen and proliferated, like medieval demographics made easy. Yeah, I agree. I'm just curious. I'm actually curious that no one's done it yet. I'm wondering if it will take somebody, I don't know, on the publisher side or creator side to kind of incentivize or work with someone directly to get some of their stuff in. I mean, there are games, I've got Harn, which I really love just the crunchiness of it, but I just can't imagine running it. But if I could get it in a way that it was on, I don't know, Fantasy Grounds, Roll20, even its own app or something, because I don't need necessarily the online component. I just need a way of mapping a bunch of the more crunchy stuff into something that's a little bit easier for my overfilled brain to run. I would do it in a heartbeat. The future of Swords Wizardry, where we are going, suspects. Okay, so maybe Swords and Wizardry are planning to have a more. I definitely feel like that we're in the age now of the connected role playing game, and I am at this point. I think I'm fairly shocked that every new RPG doesn't come out with some sort of app integration at this point. I feel like if you're coming out with a brand new, if you're going to, my mind, obviously, you're coming out with, you're going to kickstart a brand new RPG. I just think you ought to have some kind of connected application, whether it's on a website, whether it's in a mobile or tablet app, hopefully both. I just think you should have those integrations. It should just be, you should just have it in there. It's one thing when you're looking at version 2 of something's already existing, but I think if you're putting out something new, put the app integrations in there. I just think it just should be part of it now. Just like when, when you're anything you download, you have HBO, you just expect there to be an HBO app, and sure enough there is, or any kind of TV thing, there's an app. I think with the RPGs, there's no reason why you shouldn't have an app to help you go through character creation, maybe give you quickly accessible rules and ways to just calculate skills or spells or anything else you're doing. Should be part of it. Ask him about convention games he runs. I will, because I have yet to go to a convention, and I find it endlessly fascinating. That's the one bummer. When I was in Houston, I didn't go to any cons. I didn't, even though there were around. I don't know when North Texas started, but I'm pretty sure it was still going when I was there. And now that I'm in New York City, nothing runs close to here. No cons. I mean, there's Connecticut, and I think there's maybe something in Jersey. Otherwise, it just seems like you just have to travel a far ways, which just makes me sad and makes it painful. Hey, Pex, if you want to hop on the mic real quick, what is Bards and Gnomes? I feel like there's an inside joke on Bad Mike and his ice cream truck that I don't know about. Bad Mike says, I think it's so crazy that New York doesn't have any major gaming cons. It's crazy in the fact that we're such a population center, yes, but it is, I'm sure it is frightfully expensive to run a con here. And I'm just going to hop off for a quick second. I noticed my laptop's not plugged in. I'm down to 42% battery. So let me do that. Be back in a sec. Yeah, as Mage. Okay, so I'm back. So sorry. As Mage says, yeah, price point. Yeah, there's not, the other thing is there's not that many big spaces here in the city, right? So you have a Javits Center where they run New York Comic Con. Ginormous space, but I don't know how much. Obviously, New York Comic Con's been there a while. It must be, again, just super duper expensive. I think you can do pieces of it. You don't have to take the whole thing for a con, but still just really expensive. Then you kind of got to get out into more or less the sticks to get into sort of where you might have big convention type spaces. I think a lot of the hotels that have the kind of space to do cons would also be pretty expensive. They're usually, smack dab in the middle of Manhattan, and it's just, space is expensive and you're going to have to pay for it. So yeah, as Mage points out, you have to go outside New York City. Yeah, Jersey, Connecticut, somewhere else, which is fine. Philadelphia, I guess, has, what is it? One of the, not Geek and Sundry. What are the guys? They have like I know there's a con in Philly. I should try out. I think it's like a board game. Is it what, the Unplugged, PAX Unplugged? I think that's the one that might be in Philly. So that's maybe a closer sort of big city one. It's only a couple. It's like 2 hours by subway, 2 hours by train. So it's not terribly far. It would be doable to do for a day. Yeah, PAX. Yeah, one of the PAXs. Yeah, so from New York City to Philly, the easiest train ride is Amtrak, but it's like $100 each way. My sister used to live outside Philly, so I've made that trip before. So yeah, it's doable, but it's I guess you're subbing out paying for whatever the hotel rates for. If you're taking the direct route, $200 to go there and back. There is a much cheaper way through New Jersey Transit, but it's twice as long, and it can be quite a pain. So getting all your New York City Transit talk here today on the Breakfast Chat. So, Pex, what is Bards and Gnomes?
That worked out really well. I got a phone call right before logging back in again.
Awesome. And chat has exploded with stuff. Peck says I should ask you your official thoughts on Bards and Gnomes, but I have no idea what Bards and Gnomes Bards and Gnomes is.
He's dicking around. He knows that I'm not a big fan of gnomes, and I'm not a big fan of bards. So
I got you. I played a bard back in the day, but I have to say I spent a lot of time farting around and not doing too much actual useful stuff. So it was kind of fun, but I could also see that maybe if I looked back at it, I was kind of subtly or not so subtly trolling the party.
Yeah, I think that's what happens with bards. Even nowadays, if you look at the jokes that people play in 5th edition bards, you look around on the internet and see what people say about bards, and it's pretty hilarious. People just don't take them seriously.
The having sex with anything meme, yeah, that's pretty good. And gnomes, what's your pain point with gnomes?
Oh, it's just that I don't know. They're just redundant. I dislike bards a lot more than I dislike gnomes, but they just seemed like sort of a cross between halflings and dwarves. It probably goes back to the particular 1st edition view of gnomes. The more magical gnomes of later, and tinkering gnomes tinkering at shit. What's the swearing level allowed on this show, by the way?
I don't usually swear, but you can swear up a storm.
If that's just in case it slips out like it just did. Yeah, I'm not fond of the idea of gnomes as being tinkers, because that's sort of more, to my mind, that's a dwarvish thing, making stuff. But the sort of slightly illusionisty gnomes, that's okay. But I'm not in general fond of them.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of where I came out on Kender. Whenever Kender came out, I guess, with Dragonlance, they always felt like they're just obnoxious halflings.
Yeah, I had the same feeling on Kender.
So I guess if someone, Pex said I should ask you about convention games. I have never been to a convention. So definitely anything about running or playing convention games, I'm sort of fascinated by. I assume if somebody came to your convention game with a rolled up gnome bard, that would you make them change, or would you just put your hatred in check?
They wouldn't have the option, because they wouldn't find either of those in the rule books. Swords and Wizardry doesn't have gnomes, or maybe it does, but it's not.
Does it complete? I think one of them's got to have it, right? And bards, I mean, they came out and they were in one of the Dragon mags back in the day, right? So they
I think it fell outside of the time period that I was looking for. Now, illusionists did fall within the timeline of when we're talking about, and illusionists are actually left out for legal reasons rather than anything else, because the illusionist that was described in the issue of, I think it was Strategic Review, bore absolutely no relationship to anything that you could find in the OGL and the SRD. It was and because of that, it was and it was very creative type stuff. It was a terrible character class, but it was really had a lot of creative stuff in it. And you put those two things together, and you've got a copyright violation. If you duplicate a lot of creative material, then you're not duplicating rules. You're duplicating a lot of that creative stuff. So that's the reason why you can't play an illusionist of any class using Swords and Wizardry. We will almost certainly, when we start doing these house rule supplements for it after the Kickstarter comes in, there'll almost certainly be an illusionist class, but it will be different perforce from what was put into the Strategic Review. It'll be probably better designed. I think, like I said, it was a pretty bad character class, and so that there will be some sort of illusionist. Probably Pex is going to be he's beginning to politic for a bard class immediately, I suspect. So that stuff will come out, but in terms of the core central rule system, that will never have an illusionist class that duplicates what it was back in the day, because it's not legally duplicable.
Gotcha. Would something like the original version of the Ranger squeak by, because it is so heavily inspired by Aragorn? So it's kind of outside of Wizards' direct control.
Yeah, there is a Ranger class in the book, and that also came from Strategic Review. But, for one thing, the Ranger was a better character class in terms of playability than the Illusionist was. And for two, there was the reliance on Tolkien. But most importantly the fundamental mechanisms of the Ranger class did make it into the OGL and the system reference document, unlike what was done with the Illusionist. So anything that carried forward in a fairly similar way was something that we were able to trap back and bring it in without any copyright violations.
I got you. What about some of those like oddity classes that showed up? I think there was a witch class that showed up in either Dragon or Strategic Review. Is that just on the side of just being too much its own creative thing to make it in? Or is it really just about how much, even if their abilities maybe switch classes or stuff, is it just about how much of their core stuff just ends up in the OGL in some fashion?
Yeah, I don't remember looking at a witch class, and I don't remember if that was because it was outside of the time frame or if it was because there was a big witch issue. I think it was number 43 of the Dragon magazine, but that would have been definitely into the AD&D period. I don't remember looking at a witch class, but it would have been the same problem with the Illusionist if we had that. Now, probably one actually might be able to now go back and put in a witch class that had existed back in the Strategic Review if what they did in 5th edition with the Warlock was similar to what they did with the witch in the Strategic Review, because now you've got something that is in the OGL and the 5th edition SRD that might be usable to scoop in a witch class. But Swords and Wizardry was written when the SRD was for 3rd edition, and they didn't have anything that was similar with a witch at that point. And like I said, it may have been outside the time frame anyway.
Gotcha. Speaking of house rules, what are kind of your favorite? Do you have a favorite 1 or 2, 3 house rules that you always plug into your games whenever you start one up?
Well, we were talking about convention games, and I use different initiative systems when I'm playing at a table with only, 4 or 6 people than the one that I use when I've got a table of 20, because I run really, really large convention games because it's just a beer and pretzels dungeon crawl, and you can keep your character from one to the next. So there's a reason for having, just a beer and pretzels dungeon crawl to, bring in those experience points like we were talking about. So it's just sort of like a long running campaign that only meets at conventions. With that one, I use a phased initiative system, which is it's actually more like chainmail than anything else, where spells and missiles, I've got an order of spells and missiles, movement, melee, and then just sort of switching stuff around. And I go around the table first with the spells, missiles, and turning. And then I go around the table again this is with everyone sitting in dex order. Then I go around the table again, with the movement and the melee stuff. And the effect of that is that you are hitting people for responses all around the table very quickly. You're skipping over some people, but you're getting around the table quite quickly. Then you're going around the table again. And so you're getting people become engaged much more frequently than they do if you're going one person, what do you do? Next person, what do you do? Next person, what do you do? By having it split into phases, you're moving, lightning fast, because of course it's also OD&D, so it's way faster than any modern edition. And then I use a more of a what do you do kind of thing. What do you do when there's fewer people around the table?
Yeah, I think you were using the phased one for the Jordoba streams. I always appreciate that. I also like that it gives you a little bit more tactical depth, because you have to think about the fact that depending on what you're doing, you may get hit before you're able to do it, or things might happen before you have a chance to react because of the choices you're making. So it gives you a little extra juice to those decisions of, do I move? Do I fire this? Do I run up there? What do I do?
I think it does. It's a more it's certainly more, it has more tactical depth, and that again tends to work really well with a convention game that's fairly heavy on tactics, as opposed to and like you said, I did use it in the Jordoba games as well, but in a face-to-face, small player number of games, the tactical is often a bit less important than the sort of I'm into my character, and so I'm going to do, an interesting thing, and usually it just seems to work better. It may just be that I play it well in those two circumstances, but around a table there tends to be a little bit more of the identifying with the character and doing stuff because you can see the reactions on other people's faces of laughing or being impressed or whatever it might be that you don't so much get at a convention.
Totally. Do you use callers or anything with those convention games? I was wondering, just outside of initiatives, of how do you manage a group of 20 around a table? It seems
I
huge.
don't use a caller for the normal playing of the game. I do tend to have one of the players who's played with me a bunch of times set up the marching order, and I'll often have somebody or other keeping track of one thing or another, but it's not the sort of formal caller system. I've actually never liked the caller system. I think that takes a lot of the people out of the game entirely, except for the caller.
I've never actually run one, but it's something that's come back in my mind a couple times because I know that's something has been a challenge, particularly as D&D has exploded in popularity, is people who have issues, either they're socially awkward or other issues with just being able or having, phobias or fears or just being uncomfortable talking and speaking in front of groups, particularly large groups, particularly, everyone looking at them, kind of waiting on them, that I actually thought that bringing back a caller system for some situations might help. Either if it's just a matter of shyness, they just need to kind of get over the hump. You can kind of put somebody in charge and let them kind of enjoy that for a stretch. If there's someone that maybe gets hidden behind some of the more powerful personalities, or it's a way for someone who doesn't feel or comfortable talking to still play and not feel like they have that harsh spotlight shown on them.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I think that for whatever reason, I think I'm pretty good at allaying people's social anxieties at a table. It's just something that I tend to be good at that other people, might not be so good at. I've never had a problem with anybody seeming like they were unwilling to speak when it comes to them. And partially that's because the questions that I'm asking, especially during combat, are very simple questions. Is it, anybody firing an arrow? Anybody using a missile weapon? Anybody using a missile weapon? They may raise their hand. And it's okay. What are you doing? And that, I suspect, is a much easier social interaction again than saying, okay, my character is going to do this, then do this, then do this, because it's posed in a simple question form. And once people get going and realize that they're in a sort of a comfortable situation with that, I think people who have anxiety issues, I think that tends to evaporate once you've spoken out a couple of times. And also, people who are staying quiet, I'll once again sort of posing it as a question of, what do you think about this? Or, do you have anything that you want to throw into this conversation that these two people are having? And so there's an awful lot of back and forth going on in one of these large convention games. I've never had a game at a table, at home, where anybody had any sort of social anxiety. In fact, quite the contrary, usually.
Right. I think the other thing that probably helps is that there's, particularly in the combat situations, there's less demand or pressure on feeling like you have to be eloquent, or you have to come up with some kind of amazing fictional statement of what your character's doing. You don't have to have a lot of flourishes. You can just say, yeah, I'm launching an arrow, bad guy number 3, and feel comfortable with that, as opposed to, I think, maybe part of that downside of the, whatever you want to call it, the Matt Mercer effect, whatever, is people feeling like they have to be very flowery or come up with some kind of badass, amazing, cool way of doing something. When reality is, yeah, that's nice if you want to do it, and sure, it doesn't hurt, but, you can also feel free to just, when your time comes to say, yeah, I shoot an arrow.
Yeah, and that's another thing about the convention games that I run is there's, because, and I describe them as beer and pretzels, there's very little, if any, role playing other than what, just the particular way that a player happens to play their character in tactical decisions. But it's much more tactical. It's much more puzzle solving. There's zero expectation that anyone is going to make, is going to be expected to make a flowery speech. And so, and again, it's a question. So a lot of times the answer is just, I'm going to fire my arrow at, let me think, orc number 3, stuff like that. So yeah, I think that it's, as it happens, a situation in my convention games where they don't, other than the fact that there are a lot of people in there, but the mode of communication that people are engaging in tends to be low anxiety in the first place.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you run specific modules for your con games, or are you play testing material that you're working on, or what do you? I guess when you sign up to run some con games, what goes into your calculus of what you bring to run and how you choose?
Well, it's always the same mega dungeon. Because what's happening is that these groups are exploring, deeper and deeper into it, or hitting other levels in it, or clearing out an area that hasn't been gone through in quite a while. So that part's really easy. It's always, the same mega dungeon. There may be new areas to it that I flesh out ahead of time, but I don't run modules, even ones that I've written, because those are, again, modules are not designed for 20 characters going through it. I mean, that's an army. So, it's always the same mega dungeon, and the additions to it are pretty much just, new areas to explore, new puzzles, new traps.
Yeah. So when you've been designing this mega dungeon, since you design it for a large party, what kind of things, what kind of, I guess, design decisions has that led you to make when you know that you're going to be running it for a ginormous party like 20 as opposed to 4 or 5?
Well, the biggest difficulty in running a large party, other than the communications, which, like I said, because of the initiative system and the way I do it, I've pretty much worked around the communication issues that are involved in a group of 20 people. The second most difficult thing, and this is the one that you run into most, is that it's very difficult to threaten the entire party at once with something, because you've usually got, there are going to be people who are in the middle of it, very much insulated from the external threat. So I think that you tend to see, well, first of all, more in the way of lethal puzzles than you would ordinarily see. I mean, the monster encounters, there are lots of them, but I think a lot of the people play in my games for the puzzles and the traps. But in terms of the combat and the design that you get physically, is that you have a lot of ways in which the monsters can get around behind a large group so that they can be attacked from multiple different directions at once. You're going to want to have various things that can threaten people in the middle of a party. So, ranged weapons, spells, knowing that, building, a giant net in the middle of the room that your monsters know how to release, creating threats for people who are in the middle of it. I've done a couple of things where there were, insubstantial creatures that didn't become material until they chose to. So those could get into the middle of the party. And that's a great big panic when you realize that there are things actually moving, through your group that you can't do anything with. That's another one that I've used. So, all right, I'm going to mute myself for just a second. Go on.
Yep, go for it. Any questions coming up? Anything, Pex? You got any other things you want? I should throw out there? Anybody else have anything? Obviously, I have more questions on con games, but his 3D printing company. All right, I will ask about that. Is it stuff that? I guess he's back. Oh, okay. I guess one of the last things I wanted on the dungeon design. Do you find that you alter what the physical dimensions, or do you still stick to? Because I was just thinking, if you have 20 people in your odd old 10 foot wide hallway, one well placed lightning bolt would be pretty killer against that, all of them squeezed in there. Or is everything kind of more giant in proportion, since that 3 or 4 times the amount of normal people are going to be tromping?
No, I mean, I think
there.
that if you're looking at the old school stuff with the 10-foot squares, lots of rooms that are 40 feet by 50 feet where you can fit as many as 9 people into one of the squares if they're closely packed in. I don't really run into too much situation where I really altered that whole thing. Hang on a second. I've got somebody's trying to call me desperately here. It keeps ringing and then it stops. I don't know what's going on. It's probably PAX. What were we talking about? So no, I really don't change the dimensions very much. Handling situations like a lightning bolt, that's up to them to realize that there's a risk with that. I build it the way that I build it with the threats that I put in there. And if they're thinking ahead to the kind of things that they may run into, then that's all to the good. And if they're not thinking ahead to that, then they're going to run into a situation where things can get pretty deadly.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do you find that most of the people that attend your con games, that they're people who are pretty familiar with Swords and Wizardry or OSR in general, or do you get some people who are, I don't know, just happen to see it and pop in and come from either a modern gaming standpoint or totally new?
Well, the largest group of people I'm getting in the convention games are repeat gamers at this point. Is people who they enjoy the games that I run. They they know what to expect, and so there's they're very well versed in what's going on, and then then I'd say it's about evenly mixed. People who've never played an old school type of game, and people who have but may not have played OD&D or haven't played in my particular game or not. A lot of people seem to get dragged into the game by somebody else who has played in it, and they're like, hey, you got to come play in this game. I don't think the only for sure thing that can be said about that is actually that there are lots and lots of repeat players coming back in.
I mean, I guess that's one of the nicest things you can consider about something. So you get people who are coming back.
Yeah, it's I guess I'm kind of like the Grateful Dead of gaming. I get people who just follow along from convention to convention and play in the game.
I totally believe it. So PEX has alerted me that you have a 3D printing company. You want to tell me something about that? Because 3D printers are one of the things that I've looked at with jealousy and envy at everybody, obviously including the stuff you made yourself for Dordoba, but I just don't have the room for it. So what does your company do in the 3D printing space?
We design dungeon pieces or buildings. Pretty much everything we've done so far is buildings. And a lot of the time I'm doing the design of the appearance of them, and then our sculptor Ian Lovecraft, who's a really gifted guy, sort of turns those sketches and so on into something that looks really cool. And then we do Kickstarters where we we'll put up a particular theme of things. We will have sculpted some of the stuff in advance for it, and it's a Kickstarter, and then people get delivered their STL files is the file type that a 3D object is stored in at the end of the Kickstarter, and they start printing the stuff. So that's what we do there. It's called 3D Printcraft.
Yep, Pex just dropped it into the chat. Is he's no relation to HP?
No,
Lovecraft.
He's not. It's in fact, it's a pseudonym actually, but no relation. Awesome name.
Yeah, it's a great name. If I had to pick a pseudonym, I'd probably pick something like that.
But no, so Pex has thrown up the Kickstarter link to the City of Jordabe Kickstarter that we did. A lot of the stuff that we did for the one before that, City of the Hobgoblin King, which was more of an Asian fantasy sort of look to it, is on Drive-Thru RPG, but we're still finishing up the City of Jordabe Kickstarter. We're done with it now, but we haven't put that stuff up on Drive-Thru yet.
How did you get into the 3D printing stuff? Did you just happen to be an early adopter of 3D printers, or what did you see that I mean, now it seems obvious. Oh, make all kinds of dungeons and just tabletop RPG stuff in general. But at least at first, it wasn't something that occurred to me.
Yeah, no. Well, I was not an early adopter. The bits of terrain that I did use were Hearst Arts, which is casting heavy duty plaster into bricks and then assembling what you wanted. And that was what I did at the very beginning of the Jordiba thing. And then I realized, number one, this stuff is super heavy when you start getting it in large quantities. And so that was when I got a 3D printer and started doing the printing side of things. And again, since I've got my own visions of what things look like, and they're not always terribly standard. And so that was when I kind of began getting into the design of things, because if you're talking about visuals in D&D, unusual is far, far more interesting than here's another Tudor looking house, here is another stone dungeon wall. And a lot of it you do want to repeat because you want to use your pieces over and over again. So your standard dungeon wall, for example, is super useful. But for the more unusual things, it's frustrating when you can't sculpt, but you've got this idea in your head that you're trying to express in a way that somebody else can see. And so it was really fortunate coming into to contact with Ian and having him say, hey, I could sculpt some of this stuff.
Yeah. Do you? I know that. I feel like, or I don't know, but I know having watched some of the Jordiba stuff, seeing some of the pieces, I guess, that seem to be sort of puzzle related. Have you, or do you plan to put together terrain packs that sort of model in a physical space some of the puzzles that you use in your dungeons, or was that just something you had kind of one-off, or you just used existing bits to kind of make a puzzle-like
in those
space?
I used existing bits to make puzzle-like spaces, and sometimes I would go back to the Hearst Arts, which is more flexible, since it what comes out of the process is smaller Lego-like pieces, and you can build something that's more specific to what you're looking for. And so those I would come up with the puzzle and then build the thing that represented the puzzle. We might at some point in the future, you would have to give people both the puzzle, I guess in a PDF, and the pieces in order for that to really work. I've seen a couple of 3D print, offerings that gave you smaller building blocks for puzzles. Like, here is a floor tile that has the letter A on it, and they've got the whole alphabet there, so that you could do something that involved letters on the floor, kind of a thing, or things that have some sort of writing on the walls. But I don't think that a lot of people have specifically made specific traps, other than one that you see over and over again. It's been made by many different people. I happen to like Tom Tullis's the best, but that trap that you see over and over and over again, can you guess what it is?
No, but I'm guessing maybe a pit trap. But
well, there are pit traps, but the one super specific one that shows up over and over again is the green devil face from Tomb of Horrors.
Oh, yes, I have seen that.
Yep. So that one has had many different people sculpt how that one looks, but it's really the world's most iconic trap. So I suppose there's that. Spoilers for anyone who happens to be listening who hasn't played Tomb of Horrors, but I think it's pretty safe at this point.
Yeah, it even showed up in that Spielberg movie, Ready Player One. I know that there is in the book. My wife read the book, and I know in the book it's got more about Tomb of Horrors. But the one thing from Tomb of Horrors that made it into the actual movie was, in sort of an Easter egg form, there's a image of the head. I think it's on the side of a truck or something. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, I heard about that. I haven't watched the movie, but there was, the big, hey, the green devil face showed up in the movie. So
yeah, I don't think it's a great movie, but yeah, I like I said, in the book, I think there's a whole thing where he goes through the Tomb of Horrors and actually, I think, has to confront Acererak and do something. But in the movie, that all kind of got boiled away, which it happens. But yeah, they kind of, in a little homage, they threw the demon head in there. I would have thought that maybe it'll be the next phase of all these 3D printing, is to have kind of not a 3D printed scenario, but sort of a either an interesting space or a puzzle or something, and then you have the bits to build that specific space or puzzle with the kind of 3D stuff. So you kind of have an all-in-one for a particular
Well, actually, you've
spot.
just guessed the phase that it has started moving into. You're right on the money with that. People have started publishing an adventure, and then it will have the various 3D stuff to actually make that adventure. So it will have a map, and you can just you can print it and then run your people through it. So you nailed exactly what it is that's starting to happen now.
Yeah, it just seems like the natural evolution is from kind of building. I mean, it's almost like looking at how the hobby's gone, right? From sort of the original books giving you these building blocks, but not much else, to then other people are filling in, and then it goes into kind of more or less formalized modules. And it's probably I can see a similar thing happening where you're going to go from just bits to, okay, here's corridors as opposed to bricks, to now here's a whole scenario that's all mapped out for you, and here's the models to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's going on now. That's an evolution that's happening in the Kickstarters for 3D printing.
Are you going to have 3D printed stuff for Swords and Wizardry or some kind of thing there?
Not really, because there's already, Swords and Wizardry is just, it's at its heart, it's just a basic fantasy game system. It's got much more of a swords and sorcery feel to it than a lot of the stuff that's come out later, but it's just the toolbox for building that fantasy. And there are lots and lots of, dungeon walls and dungeon designs and things like that are already out there. So that would be fairly duplicative. And let me give a quick shout out for anybody who's interested in terrain for 3D printing, is that Tom Tullis's company, Fat Dragon Games, is the best for building out an inventory of the essential pieces for running dungeon adventures. And there's a tile system that works really well with that. They clip together. And if I had to pick a company to go to for that, it's the first essential thing that most people do with 3D printing is building a dungeon, because it takes a while. 3D printing is not a fast process. So I would suggest that people go over to the Fat Dragon Games site on Drive-Thru RPG, and get the basic dungeon pack, which I think is about $15, something like that. And it's tremendously useful. And then from there, you can sort of look around and see what other stuff you want to add to it. But really, you could print for a lifetime using the things that just Fat Dragon Games has done.
Did you always play with miniatures in your games? And do you run your con games with minis, or is this a more relatively recent phenomenon?
The con games can't be done with minis because there are too many players. And so usually what I use is just generally, I've got a marching order written in one place, and then I've got, just a marching order. And then they're aware of where they are on a map. There are usually a couple of maps being passed around, because some people have mapped extensively in this mega dungeon over the years. In terms of playing at my home table, yes, I do use minis, but not for the sort of spectacular appearance or tracking everything in the dungeon. I really use them just to keep track of what's the marching order and who's within the explosion range of the fireball, kind of a thing. So, Hearst Arts, I made some very, very low little plaster walls that are essentially nothing more than markers for here's a wall here. And I may rearrange those, and half the time I'm just drawing doodles on a vinyl battle mat. Here's, where the corridor is, show me where you are, things like that. So it's definitely not the sort of formal third edition, usage of miniatures throughout and in every combat and so on and so forth. But I do use them for tracking relative locations of people and walls. Yeah.
That makes sense, because it's I've always been a theater of the mind guy. I mean, I play with minis off and on, but just for lack of space and owning miniatures, it's just always been theater of the mind first. But yeah, it is to be able to just visually see straight off kind of where you are in relation to either the bad guys or your teammates, particularly when you get into third edition later, where there's a big emphasis on kind of the more or less exact radiuses or areas of effect for spells. It definitely is super handy. I think I remember for having, I don't know if it was fourth edition or our group ended up coming up with these kind of stencils we could use for the different types of area effect to make it really easy to lay over the miniatures to see who's covered and who's not covered.
Yeah, I mean, the later editions all make miniatures much, much more necessary to the smooth functioning of the game itself. I do, 95% of the way that I play is theater of the mind, and it's really only when things come down to the very tactical, where exactly are you standing kind of a situation do we go to the minis. And a lot of times it'll be like, okay, combat starting, let's gather up this batch of minis over here that have been sitting here for the last 40 minutes. And now actually put them out into position. Here's where the walls are, here's the thing, now you can, sort of go on with that. They usually just sit in marching order in a part of the table most of the time.
Yeah. What I found is that, and it just might be me, I'm not trying to make any kind of broad statement, is that when I'm running Theater of the Mind, I'm more likely to think about details or maybe posit details that weren't spoken or weren't demonstrated. So I guess to give an example might be easier. If we're fighting in a tavern in Theater of the Mind, I might think about maybe there are tables at a certain place or chairs that I can use or kind of different terrains out there. Whereas if I'm playing with minis, I tend to think about what's been described in the physical space. And if someone hasn't drawn out tables or chairs, I'm going to assume there's nothing there. So I kind of feel like if it's not super detailed, that I actually will lose some granularity because I don't try to fill in the details if it's drawn out, whereas I will if it's in my brain.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things with miniatures is that they, for the most part, they reduce the creativity that people have got for precisely the reason that you're saying. They're looking at a thing and they're not necessarily going to apply more imagination to that. And I think one of the very powerful ways of describing things is to be somewhat vague and low detail about it, because the players will then fill in with their imaginations what things look like, and you're going to get something that's, cooler. It may not be standardized. It may not be the same for all of those people, but for each one of them, it's going to be somewhat cooler because they're visualizing it. One big exception to that I have found is I think minis do add tremendously when you are doing stuff that breaks into the third dimension. When you've got stuff that goes up with ladders or balconies or things like that, it may somewhat restrict people's imagination of what that area looks like, but by having tangible tactical elements to it, that can make for a really, really good situation. People have trouble visualizing stuff, when there's a lot of up and down and one thing might be across from another thing, or, just a little lower than another thing. Actually having that tangibly expressed somewhere on the table can be awesome. We had a great scenario one time when we were playing Deadlands, and for no particular reason, I actually built a little tiny town that had balconies and stuff in front of it, and the resulting gunfight was tremendously cool because people were running up on balconies, they were getting in between buildings, they were doing all kinds of stuff like that, and I realized, hey, the miniatures really added something in this particular kind of encounter. So, but in general, yeah, I think that using miniatures actually reduces the creativity and the richness of what's going on.
Yeah, there's no question. I think when you're looking for spatial relationships, which moving between dimensions and seeing distances between things, you can really just eyeball your minis and know exactly where you are, or where the two things are. Whereas, yeah, if you're Theater of the Mind, it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult, where you might be asking, well, how far am I again away from them? Where are they? And when you can just look at it, and your brain will just automatically, just do the math for you. It's like, okay, I'm 20 feet away, or I'm 30 feet away, or I'm at some kind of angle.
It's much easier to visualize what all's going on in 2 dimensions than it is in 3. In 3, having some sort of help with visualizing it, I think works out. In 2 dimensions, usually Theater of the Mind works just fine, unless it's like, exactly where does the fireball hit.
Yeah. So you mentioned you played Deadlands. What is do you have any favorite games that aren't D&D style that you like, or do you have some that you really has excited you to want to play?
Yeah, Call of Cthulhu is awesome. And I guess the other one for science fiction stuff, I like Classic Traveler. some of the later editions of Traveler are just fine too, but I just tend to stick with classic Traveler when I'm playing. And those are really the big three. I mean, Deadlands was fun. I'm not so much into the Wild West kind of, imaginary space, fantasy fulfillment daydream. It's not so much the West for me, but Call of Cthulhu really hits me there, and also Traveler.
Yeah, I've only played one Call of Cthulhu scenario, and it was the starter scenario from one of the box sets. But yeah, it was a blast. I think it kind of scratches a similar itch to old school D&D in that it feels super deadly, and that you're kind of up to your wits, and that you're not going to be able to just Hulk up and Superman your way through it, but that it's almost about this kind of survival and pushing your luck.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think that the whole old school concept is way more applicable to Dungeons and Dragons than it is to other games. I mean, there were games at the time that would fit into a definition of new school, way back in the 80s. There are, it makes a lot of sense when you're looking at Dungeons and Dragons and the timeline there and the complexity of the games there. But, for example, Call of Cthulhu uses a skill system, and it's, and for D&D, most people would call that non-old school because it tends to numericalize a lot of things that ought to be just puzzled out. But it works great in Call of Cthulhu for that kind of a game. And so, I don't tend to try and apply old school so much to games other than D&D.
Yeah, it's not so much how they lay out that. It's just so much the feeling, I guess, of being like a small fry in a much greater world outside you. When I played Call of Cthulhu, I didn't feel like the hero that was going to save the day. I felt like a really small thing caught up in a vast whirlwind.
Well, whoever was running the game for you then, if it wasn't you, did a tremendous job, because that's what is exactly, if you look at the underlying fiction behind the Cthulhu mythos, that's the entire concept, is that humankind is utterly insignificant, compared to the infinitely larger fish that are swimming around in the void and affecting things. And, all that you can really hope for is to stave off, even if you're a hero, all that you can hope for is to stave off some particular symptom of these much more dangerous types of things that are out there. So yeah, being an itty bitty little cog in the cosmic mechanism is that's right on point for the Call of Cthulhu feel.
Yeah, that's kind of how I always felt, at least in the first few levels of an old school D&D game. Is you're just trying to scratch out a little bit of a living that you can, and trying to avoid the attentions of these much more bigger forces than you. So I guess that's why I kind of give them like a similar feeling. But yeah, mechanically they're very different. Classic Traveler is one of the ones that's on my bucket list. In fact, I own a set of Classic Traveler. I have yet to play it, and one of the things I've always wanted to do was to take their character generation system, which I just think is amazing, and make a fantasy version of it. I just love the fact that all the ways that your character can get modified just through rolling up their that kind of backstory experience table.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember a great quote that somebody had about Traveler character generation. It was, "I'm gonna roll up my character for Traveler tonight. I wonder who I'll be," or something. It was something like that. Or I think it was, I wonder who I'll be, because you've just got zero control over what's going to come out of that system. So, or, a few, making choices of the decision branches, but it's really, really tremendously affected by the dice. All that you can give is a general direction toward what kind of character you want to play. And it may spin out something entirely different.
All right. And there's even a chance like you can die in character generation. You might not even survive, which is another fascinating angle.
Yeah, I like that. But it's a great system, a lot of fun.
But yeah, I've always been of the kind of discover your character through generation. It's just, I guess, I don't know. I see a lot of people now. I remember someone posted to, I don't know, it was Facebook or Reddit or somewhere, and they really couldn't fathom rolling up a character for an old school game, because they really just they couldn't wrap their brain around the fact that you were going to roll first and decide afterwards what they would be, because they were so used to coming at it from, hey, I'm going to be this thing and I'm going to just sculpt my character to match. Whereas, if you're playing kind of by the book, it's like, well, you're not going to do that. You're going to see what stats you have, and then you're going to see what can I be. And I always just like that, because otherwise I think I would probably play the same guy over and over again if I could just play my druthers each time.
And that's, in the convention games that I run, we roll 3d6 straight up for the attributes, but I do let people rearrange them so that they can be whatever it is that they want to be, because it's a convention game, and also there's the issue of trying to balance the party out and so on. But yeah, I think that's a very much, I guess you could describe it as an old school. It's certainly a characteristic of a lot of the older school games that you roll first and then you play it as it lays. I can actually be a paladin because I've happened to roll, a 17 or 18 for my charisma. So, that's a go. Or on the other hand, I'm a fighter because I don't have the stats for anything else.
Yeah, totally. I think in that Swords and Wizardry game I played in a few years ago, I played a halfling thief because that's pretty much, I was just trying to maximize what I had, and that ended up being the best combo, and it ended up being a really good character. But I don't think I would have chosen halfling or thief if I could have just, I don't know, used point array or point buy or whatever it was to just generate it. So I like those happy accidents. I know they're not for everybody, and obviously if people you're playing with or your style isn't that, but I always think it's something that I feel like gets a little bit maligned, particularly players who and maybe GMs who haven't run or play it, because they only see the limits of it and they don't see those kind of the possibilities that come with that kind of happy accident that you might make your favorite character you've ever had and you didn't try to make it. It just happened, almost to you.
Yeah, and again, that's partly because of the amount of time that it takes to make a character in the newer editions, which is a lot longer than what it took in the older editions. And your characters, had a fairly good chance of dying off at the beginning. And so, treating that aspect of it, almost like a board game where, let's roll and find out what you get, was something that was more feasible. And, like you said, I mean, it causes you to play different stuff that you might not have thought of and come up with the stratagems that are going to work for something that you really didn't have in mind when you sat down at the table, and that you can end up with a favorite character that you never would have played if you had sat down and made the choice ahead of time based on what you thought would be the favorite character you'd ever played.
Yeah, that is a good point about the character generation times, because that's kind of a pain point. 5th edition, and I guess in other games too, modern games, but at least now with things like Roll20 and D&D Beyond and whatnot, they've taken some of the sting out of that. But there's I feel like it's almost a whole other game, because people really get into the generating their characters and optimizing their characters and creating the backstories for their characters and kind of finally crafting everything. And I just for me personally, it just doesn't appeal to me at all. I'm always that player that I don't care what my character was before they started adventuring. I just want to know what happens after they started. So, I'm usually like the happy-go-lucky guy. I think my Swords and Wizardry halfling thief was like a tourist, and he just he needed more money because he was on like a walking tour of the world. And so he took on the job that ended up being kind of the adventure hook, but he really had nothing. He was just, I'm just a guy walking around trying to find himself in the world. Not the son of a demon and a half god, not the, I don't know, whatever, amazing but kind of crazy stuff that people come up with. But I just feel like maybe I'm from a different time or a different place. But I know that's a big thing now, is the whole backstory and character love of just making and finally crafting a character.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly with you on that. The fun of the game is seeing what story emerges from playing the game. It's not trying to define particularly much about your character ahead of time.
Yeah, it that definitely has different. I think what ends up happening is it places different emphasis, right? Because like you were saying about with old school character or OSR characters, Swords of Wizardry style characters, that they can kind of be easy come, easy go, because you only put 5 minutes into generating them. So if they die 5 minutes into the campaign, no big deal. Whereas if you've spent 2 days, and even if it wasn't 2 days and going through and doing the math on creating the character, but just the mind share of thinking about it, and he's got some amazing backstories, the son of a god and a demon and all this stuff. Well, then the idea that this character dies in the first 5 minutes the campaign. It becomes less and less tenable.
Yeah, I mean, it tends to create a kind of a social contract that you'll get a lot more chances at living, and that reduces the feeling of the potential lethality of the thing that, I could die. Well, that adds a lot of spice to an encounter or a trap or something like that. If you can die in it, you've got to make a new character. Whereas, I think when you have to spend more time in character generation, there's pretty much the assumption that you're not going to run into situations that are truly lethal, particularly often, just because it would be, okay, great, let's stop the game now for the next, 40 minutes while we make up a new character kind of a thing.
Yeah, it ends up being that kind of, I guess a spiral, right? Because that leaves expectations on the player side that I put all this time into his character so we can't kill him, to the GM wanting to find something that's balanced because they understand that the challenge is in putting the characters at risk, but they want to make sure that this is a risk they can overcome, because we don't want this character to die because the player put in, 4 days into creating the character, and that kind of puts a big emphasis on that encounter part of the balancing, which I don't like, but there's no question that it's a big part of how people play and run 5th edition is around that, trying to find that balance between a challenge that is potentially lethal without it necessarily being lethal.
And that's one of the reasons that, a system matters. You have even some subtle differences between two systems, and it can lead to fairly different outcomes. And that's one of the things on this Kickstarter that we're trying to at least, get this idea across to people who've only ever played 5th edition, is that this different rule set, even though it is a precursor, leads to a lot different gaming experience when you're playing it than simply something that is simpler. I mean, it is simpler, it is faster, but because of those things, there are a lot of unintended consequences or unexpected consequences that branch out from that, like, the increased lethality because it takes less time to create a character class, and therefore there's not as much pressure on the DM to let people survive. And as the result of that, you've got more tension going on in the various adventures because the combats don't take as long, that you've got puzzle solving, and you've got exploration tending to take a bigger piece. There are a lot of different things that emerge from playing Swords and Wizardry or original D&D, as opposed to the way that the same fundamental game branches out once it becomes more complex and more tailored to, having tactical options that are particular to a character and so on and so forth. They're very, very, they're far more different than you would actually imagine.
And just because one is branded 5th edition doesn't make it, I had someone get into this with me, doesn't make it that it's better or somehow an advancement. They're different and they have different sensibilities. But I remember someone getting into it with me because they were, suggesting that because, AD&D and therefore 2nd edition, 3rd edition, they were all basically like, they were all linear improvements like your software versions, that obviously OS X is better than OS 9, and that therefore, 5th edition must be inherently better than 1st edition or something else because it is, it is a later version. But yeah, they are very different, and they're products of different times, different sensibilities, and you never know, you may really take to something with that older sensibility, or that sensibility that was more prevalent back in the day might be the sensibility for you. You just got to try it, right? And give it a shot.
I think there's, you can objectively judge systems based on how easily they are understood. How streamlined is the layout? Because original D&D clearly falls down on the organization and the layout that was done by TSR back when they had absolutely no earlier role-playing game in existence to learn from any of its mistakes. They just did it, and so the layout and the learning process are harder with original D&D, but games don't evolve not toward better and better. They reflect differences, and like I said, some of those small differences can lead to very big differences in the playing style. And one pretty good example of to combat the idea that every later version is better, is that, the 3rd edition players didn't think 4th edition was better.
No, they did not.
So I think that, the balloon on that one burst pretty much on 4th edition, I think. So the linear advancement of systems.
Thanks so much for talking to me. It was really a pleasure. If you have any last things you want to plug or throw out there, feel free.
John Barnhouse will kill me if I don't tell people to go out there and back the Kickstarter. And so go out and back the Kickstarter. And the other additional thing to say is, whatever kind of D&D it is you play, imagine the hell out of it.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, thanks again. Hopefully we can do this again sometime. It was really great. Thanks, Pex, for throwing it together, but I'll let you get on with the rest of your day. I've taken up too much of it already. And thanks to everyone who hung out in the chat and listened. I will try to get this up ASAP in podcast form for folks who were not able to attend, but have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend. And I will talk to you later.
Thanks a lot, Todd.